My name is Loretta May Voss, and I am 71 years old. I have outlasted a drought that killed half the county's cattle, a flood that took the lower barn, a husband's slow death from a disease that didn't have the decency to move quickly, and 43 years of keeping a farmstead alive on the kind of stubbornness most people mistake for strength. I have buried a man I loved. I have raised 3 sons on ground I helped clear with my own hands. And I have watched every one of those sons stand in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning in April and tell me to pack what I needed and be gone by the weekend. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to the house they wanted, the land they wanted, the equipment, the outbuildings, the storage shed by the road, the lower pasture, the woodlet, the water rights along the creek. They forgot the Springhouse. That is where this story begins. Not with the eviction, not with the lawyer's letter, not with the 3 of them lined up across my kitchen table like a tribunal they'd rehearsed in some parking lot somewhere. It begins much earlier, on a cold March morning about 8 weeks before that Tuesday, when a woman with a broken-down car and a canvas bag and nowhere obvious to be knocked on my door at 6:30 in the morning, and I did what my mother taught me to do. I let her in and put the kettle on. My husband Clem passed 4 years ago this November. Clemson Harlan Voss. 48 years married, and he was the kind of man who woke up before dawn not because he had to but because he liked the dark before the light, liked the way the farm looked before the world got its noise back, before the birds even, when the fog was still sitting in the bottom field and the air smelled like cold dirt and creek water and the particular sweetness of hay left in a barn overnight. He used to say the farm had a different character at 5 in the morning than it did at any other hour, and that if you wanted to know what you actually owned you had to get up early enough to see it without the day's complications on top of it. He died of pulmonary fibrosis, which is a clinical way of saying his lungs forgot how to breathe and the forgetting took 3 years to finish. I was his nurse through it, his driver to the appointments in Knoxville, the person who managed his medications and his oxygen equipment and who learned to read the numbers on the pulse oximeter the way a farmer reads a weather gauge, with the understanding that whatever the number said, you had to respond to it whether you were ready or not. I slept in the chair beside his bed in the final months because lying flat had become something his body couldn't manage. I held his hand through the nights he couldn't sleep. I talked to him about the farm, about what the lower field was doing, about the woodlet and the creek and what I'd seen that morning from the kitchen window, and he would listen with his eyes closed and sometimes he would smile. Our sons visited on holidays. They called on Sundays. Mostly. After Clem died, the farm got harder. Not impossible, just harder in the way that things get harder when you remove the second person from any 2-person operation and expect the work to stay the same. The equipment was old and getting older in ways that cost money each time something broke. The lower field needed drainage work we'd been putting off because drainage work on 214 acres is not a small project and Clem had been sick for 3 years, and after he was gone I was just getting through the seasons. I had a woman named Darlene who came 3 days a week and helped with the heavy cleaning and the grocery runs and who sometimes sat with me at the kitchen table and drank coffee without saying very much, which was exactly what I needed. I had our neighbor Roy Pickett, a widower himself, who ran his equipment over my fields in planting season in exchange for the use of my covered equipment shed, which was the best arrangement available given the circumstances. It was imperfect. It was mine. And it was enough. My sons are Harlan, Dale, and Mitchell. Harlan is the oldest, 49, an accountant who has built a life in Knoxville around the certainty that everything in the world can be evaluated if you find the right measure. He has the kind of ordered intelligence that serves him well in his profession and makes him difficult at Christmas. Dale is 46, sells commercial real estate in Nashville, and has inherited the charm that skipped Harlan entirely. Dale is the son who walks into a room and remembers everyone's name after one meeting, who can make a stranger feel like an old friend in 20 minutes, and who I have watched use that gift with more calculation than warmth for most of his adult life. Mitchell is 42, the youngest, the quietest. He lives 40 minutes from the farm, runs a small landscaping business, and came around more than his brothers but not as much as 40 minutes should allow. Mitchell was always the one I worried about least and watched most carefully. He had his father's quality of silence, the kind that holds things rather than hiding them. I don't tell you about my sons to condemn them. I tell you because you need to understand who these men are, what they carry, what they want from the world before you can understand what they chose to do. Clem's will was clear. He had written it with a Maryville attorney named Gerald Huff during the second year of his illness, when he was still clear-eyed enough to be deliberate about things. The farm came to me. All of it. The house, the land, every structure on the property including the Springhouse at the northeast edge where the old creek cut through the hillside. He had been specific about the Springhouse in a way that surprised Gerald Huff and did not surprise me at all, because Clem understood what that building had meant to our family and to me in particular, and he was not a man who left the important things to implication. He had told me his reasoning the summer before his diagnosis. We were sitting on the porch in the July heat, drinking iced tea from the blue pitcher I still use, watching the light change over the bottom field, and he said he'd seen what happened when a man divided his land among sons. He'd watched it happen to his own father's property, and to two neighbors' farms in the years after. He said land turns brothers into surveyors. He said the only way to keep a farm whole was to give it to one person and trust that person to make good decisions about the rest. He looked at me when he said it. He put his hand over mine on the porch railing. He said he trusted my judgment more than any legal document he'd ever signed. I had the will. I had a deed in my name. What I didn't have, as it turned out, was sons who'd come to terms with either. The farm is 214 acres in Harlan County, Tennessee. Good land, not exceptional, but the kind of land that rewards attention and punishes neglect, which is true of most things worth having. Bottom fields that flood in wet years and yield well when the drainage cooperates. A woodlot that Clem selectively harvested over 2 decades with the patience of a man who thought in 30-year increments. A back pasture that had run cattle in better years and now sat in hay. A creek that came down off the ridge and ran along the northeast edge of the property before it turned south toward the picket land, and along that creek, built into the hillside in the years when people still built things to last, the Springhouse. Clem's grandfather Luther Voss constructed it in 1922, which I know because he scratched the year into the mortar between 2 of the stones on the east wall, along with his initials and a small cross that I've always thought was either religious or a compass mark. I could never determine which. The walls are local fieldstone, laid without a plumb line but with a precision that 200 years of craft knowledge produces, for courses thick, set into the hillside so that the earth itself insulates the interior. The creek water enters through a stone channel at the back, runs beneath the flagstone floor in a carved trough, and exits through a corresponding channel at the front, and this circulation of 40-degree water keeps the interior at a steady 53 degrees in every month of every year, summer or winter, dry year or wet. Luther Voss built it for milk and butter in the era before refrigeration, when a 53-degree room was not a luxury but a necessity for any farm that kept animals. His son used it the same way. Clem used it for storage and for the butter his mother taught him to make and which he continued making well into our marriage, until his hands got too stiff for the churn. I used it for something else. But I need to get there in the right order, because the Springhouse is not just where this story ends. It is also where it was quietly building for a decade before any of this happened, in the still cold air behind a stone door that my sons had never thought to open. The morning the woman knocked on my door, it was a Wednesday in the first week of March. Cold for March, the ground still hard, the sky the color of old pewter, the kind of morning that makes you grateful for the forced air furnace Clem finally installed in 2008 after 30 years of the oil stove. I had been up since 5. That is my hour and has been for 30 years and will be until the day I am no longer able to rise at it. I had coffee going and was working through the seed catalog I'd been meaning to read since January, making notations with a pencil in the margins the way I do every year. And the kettle had just finished when I heard gravel under tires and then the particular silence of a car stopping before the engine cuts off and then footsteps and then nothing for a few minutes, and then the knock. She was standing on the porch step in the pre-dawn gray, tall, somewhere around 50 though I'd revise that later, with dark hair pulled back without much ceremony and a canvas duffel bag on one shoulder, and a good wool coat that was unfortunately about 10 degrees short of adequate for a morning like that one. Her right hand had a cut on it, fresh, the kind you get catching yourself on a latch. At the foot of the driveway I could see her car with the hood raised and the orange hazard lights blinking in the dark. She said she needed to use a phone. She said she was sorry to bother me. She said her phone was dead and she'd been walking about 1.5 miles. I told her to come in. She hesitated in the doorway the way people do when they've been raised properly and have it in them that you don't take things from strangers. And I said it's 38 degrees and you've got a cut on your hand and the coffee is already made, and she came in. Her name was Caroline. She gave me her first name without hesitation and her last name without being asked a few minutes later. Steed. Caroline Steed. She sat in Clem's old chair at the kitchen table, the one with the worn armrests and the slight lean to the left that I've never had fixed because fixing it would make it someone else's chair. And she held the mug in both hands and looked out the window at the bottom field in the gray coming light and didn't say anything for a full minute. Then she said, "You've got good land here." I said it was all right. She said no, she meant it. She wasn't making conversation. She was looking at the field the way a person looks when they're reading something they know how to read. She said, "The drainage in the lower field, you've got some work to do there, but the soil structure is right. What are you planting this year?" I told her corn in the lower half and soybeans in the back, rotating off last year's. She asked about the drainage tile situation and whether I'd considered cover cropping, and we were 4 minutes into a conversation about winter rye before I'd finished filling her mug a second time. She knew things. She used words I recognize from 40 years of farming, specific technical words, not the generic enthusiasm of a person who'd read an article somewhere. I watched her and filed the observation. Her phone came to life on my charger at just past 7. She made a call that went to voicemail, left a careful and efficient message, called a second number. The county road tow service told her they were 2 hours out. Problem with the water main closer to town taking priority. She put the phone down and looked at me with the expression of someone who has learned to absorb logistical inconvenience without complaint. She said she didn't want to take up my morning. I told her 2 hours wasn't taking up anything. I told her to eat one of the biscuits in the tin. We talked for most of those 2 hours. Not about large things at first. About the county, about the farm, about the price of fuel and what it was doing to operations like mine. About the drought 2 years before and the flood the year before that. She asked about my setup, about what I ran for equipment, about whether I had help. I told her about Darlene and about Roy Pickett's arrangement. She listened the way some people do, with her whole attention rather than the partial attention most people offer while they're already composing their response. Somewhere around the second cup of coffee I told her about Clem. About the fibrosis, about the 3 years of it, about what those years had looked like from inside them. I don't usually tell that story to people I've known for less than an hour. I couldn't tell you exactly why I told it to her, except that she asked about the empty chair across the table with just her eyes and no words, a small glance, and somehow that was the kind of asking that deserved a real answer. She didn't offer condolences in the way people do, the way that is actually about making themselves comfortable with someone else's grief. She just sat with what I'd said for a moment and then she said, "He sounds like he was worth missing." That was all. And it was exactly the right thing and exactly what most people cannot manage to say, so they say something else instead. Around 8:30 she asked if she could walk the property while she waited. The light was up by then, that thin March light that doesn't warm you but at least tells you where you're going. I said yes and pulled on my barn coat and walked it with her because I wanted to, not because I needed to. We went down through the lower field and she looked at the soil structure the way she'd looked at it from the window, with the focus of someone making assessments. Through the woodlet, the creek audible before visible, the bank still frozen at the edges though the center ran free. Up the northeast hillside to the Springhouse. She stopped 10 feet from it and just looked at it for a moment before walking closer. The way she looked at it was different from the way she'd looked at everything else. Not the appraising look of someone evaluating an asset. Something more careful. She touched the mortar between the stones, ran her fingers along the joint the way you'd read Braille. "This is original construction," she said. "The mortar's never been replaced." 1922, I said. She crouched and looked at the entry channel where the creek water disappeared into the stone floor. She stood up and looked at the door, which is a single plank of white oak that Clem rehung in 1994, and which is held by iron hardware that may be older than the building itself. "Are you using this?" she asked. I told her I was. "For what?" I looked at her for a moment. She was looking at the Springhouse, not at me, and her expression was one of genuine interest, the pure variety, not the kind with an agenda behind it. I had a feeling about that look. I had been farming and living and watching people long enough to know the difference between a person who wants to know something because they find it interesting and a person who wants to know something because they're deciding what to do with it. She was the first kind. I told her I'd tell her another time. She accepted that without a flicker of offense or pressure, turned back to look at the creek channel, and said she appreciated the tour. That response, the immediate uncomplicated acceptance, told me as much about her as the rest of the morning had. The tow truck came at 9:15. She thanked me twice, once at the door and once from the cab of the truck, leaning out the rolled-down window. She said, "I'll be passing through again in a few weeks." She said it like a statement that was actually an inquiry, careful and respectful of whatever answer it received. I told her the coffee would be on. She came back 17 days later. Her car was running fine this time. She pulled up the drive around noon on a Saturday carrying a jar of raw honey from a farm in eastern Kentucky, and no particular explanation for returning except that she had said she would, and apparently she kept her word. I took the honey. I put the kettle on. We spent most of that afternoon in the Springhouse. I should tell you properly what was in there, because the Springhouse is not incidental to this story. It is the story. Everything else, the eviction, the legal documents, the Tuesday morning tribunal at my kitchen table, is preamble. The Springhouse is the thing they missed. It is the thing they forgot to assess because they had already decided it was nothing, and that assumption is the error that unravels everything that comes after. When Clem was still alive, when the farm was a full operation rather than the reduced version it became after his diagnosis, I had more produce than any family could use. We ran cattle, I kept a kitchen garden, I had the fruit trees along the upper fence row. And I had started something else, something I had come to almost sideways one August when a neighbor 2 counties over, a woman named Bet Hamlin who I'd known since our children were small, gave me a mesophilic starter culture wrapped in a damp cloth and a copper pot she no longer used and a Saturday afternoon's worth of instruction that changed the direction of my kitchen life in ways I could not have predicted. Bet made soft cheeses, farmhouse styles, simple and quick and very good. I took what she'd given me and I made those too for a season or two, and then I started asking questions she couldn't answer and I found other sources of answers. Books, mostly old technical texts and newer ones from cheesemakers in Vermont and Wisconsin who had started writing about traditional methods the way you write about things that are disappearing, with urgency and love mixed together. I learned about bacterial cultures and what they did to milk over time. I learned about pH and temperature and humidity and why a cave at 53 degrees produces a different cheese than a refrigerator at 38, something about the microbiology, about the living nature of a well-made aged cheese that a mechanical cooler cannot replicate. I learned that the stone walls of a building like ours carry their own microbial character, that the particular mixture of organisms in the air of that hillside Springhouse was unique to that location in the same way a terroir is unique to a vineyard, and that this specificity was not a curiosity but a quality that could not be purchased or relocated or reproduced. I started with cheddar because cheddar is forgiving in the way that most classic things are. It rewards consistency and punishes carelessness, but it doesn't punish honest mistakes the same way the harder styles do. I made it for a season in the Springhouse and aged it on the stone shelves Clem's grandfather had set into the back wall, 3 tiers of flat-cut local limestone, and when I pressed my first wheel and waxed it and marked it and set it on the shelf to begin its months of aging, I felt something I had not felt in years. The particular satisfaction of doing a difficult thing correctly, of making something that could not be hurried. I made Colby the next year, and a soft fresh style I served to anyone who came to the table, and which disappeared faster than I could cut it. Clem ate everything I made with the focused attention he brought to the things he loved. He told me once it was the finest thing that had ever come out of that Springhouse, and then he corrected himself and said, "After your mother's butter," and looked at me sideways to see if I'd caught the joke, and I had, and we both laughed. After his diagnosis I kept making it. Baking is what some women do when grief gets heavy because the precision of it requires your full attention and leaves no room for the other thing. Cheese was that for me. The cultures required tending. The aging required monitoring. The temperatures had to be checked, the rinds turned, the humidity managed. It gave the days a structure that loss had taken away, and structure is not a small thing when you are surviving the long slow end of a marriage. After he died I kept making it because it was mine. Because I had built something there, on those stone shelves in that hillside room, that was entirely of my own invention and my own labor. Because it was the one part of the farm that no one else had defined or managed or commented on. The rest of the farm had history layered into it from before I arrived on it, 3 generations of Voss men and their decisions about what went where and how things were run. The Springhouse and what I'd made of it was the first thing on this property that was purely, only, completely mine. I had been approached 3 times by a woman from Knoxville named Paula Hess, who ran a specialty food business that distributed regional artisan products to restaurants and high-end grocery accounts in 3 states. She had first tasted my aged cheddar at a dinner party at the Pickett's house 2 years after Clem died, tracked it back to my farm through Roy, and driven out to speak with me on a Wednesday afternoon in September. She was direct and professional, and what she said about the cheese was not complimentary in the way that guests are complimentary. She said it in the way a person says something they have decided is true and wants you to understand is true. She said it had depth and complexity she had not encountered in a domestic farmstead cheese in this region, that the aging environment was producing a character she believed was not replicable, and that she thought there was a real market for it at a price point that would surprise me. I told her I appreciated that, but I wasn't ready. She came back 6 months later. I told her the same thing. She came a third time, earlier that same winter before Caroline knocked on my door, and she handed me a card and said, "When you're ready, please call me. I want to be first." Her card was on the shelf above the kitchen sink the morning I let Caroline in out of the cold. That Saturday afternoon Caroline and I went through the Springhouse together, and I showed her everything. The aging shelves and the current inventory, 24 wheels at various stages of development, the copper equipment in the back room, the cultures I maintained in small jars with the careful daily attention that living things require. The notebooks. I have 5 of them now, cloth-covered composition books bought from a grocery store, filled with records of every batch I'd made since the beginning. Temperature logs, humidity readings, culture observations, tasting notes in my own shorthand, records of what worked and what didn't and why I thought so. Caroline moved through the space the way she'd moved through the property that first morning. Methodically, quietly, with the focus of someone who is reading something rather than just looking at it. She examined the culture jars. She read the labels on the shelves. She asked questions that told me she was not simply curious but genuinely informed. She knew the difference between a mesophilic and thermophilic culture, and why it mattered. She understood cave aging and rind development, and why the specific temperature range I maintained produced a different biological outcome than a controlled cooler. She asked about my salt ratios, about my press weights, about how I developed the particular aging protocol for the harder styles. I asked her where she'd learned all of that. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the back wall of shelves. She said, "I worked in food for a long time. In different capacities." That was all she gave me, and I let it sit. I was learning that Caroline answered questions on her own schedule. She asked to taste the aged cheddar. I cut her a wedge from the wheel I'd cracked open the previous week, the one I'd been eating myself for the last few days. She tasted it the way you taste something when you're paying professional attention to it rather than social attention. She held it for a moment, chewed slowly, was quiet. Tasted it again. She set the rest of the wedge down on the cutting board. She looked at me directly. She said, "This is not a hobby cheese." I told her I'd been making it for a decade. She said, "That's obvious. What's also obvious is that you have no idea what you actually have here." I said I had some idea. She said, "With respect, I don't think you do." She wasn't being unkind. She was being the kind of precise that some people are when the subject matters to them. She said she wanted to be straightforward with me because she thought I deserved straightforwardness. She said the combination of things I had in that Springhouse, the water source, the stone aging environment, the microbial character that a century of animal and plant and human activity had given to the air in that hillside, the cultures I developed and maintained over a decade, and the specific skill I had built in managing all of it together, that combination was not a common thing. That it took time to build and could not be quickly replicated. That what was on those shelves was not storage. It was an asset of a kind that the people who owned land in this county did not typically think to inventory when they were tallying what they had. I looked at the shelves. I looked at the 5 composition notebooks in the wooden crate beside the door. She said, "Whoever ends up with this Springhouse ends up with considerably more than stone and creek water." We sat on the hillside above the Springhouse in the late afternoon light, the cold not quite as bitter as it had been that morning, and she asked about my sons. I gave her the outline. She asked how old they were, what they did. I told her. She listened the way she listened to everything without comment, filing it away. She asked if they knew what was in the Springhouse. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said Harlan knew I made cheese the way you know a neighbor keeps a garden, as a vague fact about someone else's leisure time, something you acknowledge once and never revisit. Dale had been inside the Springhouse once, years ago, to help Clem move some irrigation equipment before a winter, and had not been back and had not asked. Mitchell knew I went up to the Springhouse regularly, and had simply never inquired why. I had assumed his silence was a kind of respect. I thought about that assumption now, sitting on the hillside with Caroline, and wondered if it was respect or if it was the same incuriosity the others had, just quieter. She asked why I hadn't told them more. I looked at the lower field for a long while before I answered. I said because it was mine. Because after Clem died and the farm became something I was managing alone, a great deal of what I owned had already been slowly and quietly redefined in my sons' minds as something in transition, something being held in place until the next thing happened. The land was Voss land, meaning it was their inheritance waiting to be claimed. The equipment was a resource to be evaluated for efficiency or liquidation. The house was a property to be managed. Every time Harlan called on a Sunday, I could hear in the way he asked about the roof or the tractor or the yield on the back pasture that he was not asking out of interest but out of inventory. He was keeping a list. He was updating columns. The Springhouse was the exception. I had never offered it and they had never asked. And in that silence I had built 10 years of something entirely my own, and I had kept it mine by the simple method of not announcing it. And there was a kind of fierce quiet satisfaction in that which I wasn't entirely ready to give up. Caroline nodded slowly. She said that made complete sense. She said it as though she understood it from the inside rather than the outside. As though she had kept things to herself for her own reasons and knew what that cost and what it protected. Then she said, "But I think you already know that the quiet is going to have to end." I said I was beginning to understand that. I asked her what she thought I should do. She said she thought I needed to talk to someone who understood what I had. She said she'd been thinking about it since the first visit, and that she knew the regional specialty food market, knew the demand side of what I was producing, knew the names of the buyers who would understand immediately what they were looking at when they walked through that door. She said she wasn't proposing anything. She was just saying that the time for keeping it a private satisfaction might be ending. I asked her what had brought her down this road the first morning. The broken-down car, the long cold walk. She looked at the field. She said she'd been driving back from her daughter's place and had taken the long way because she wasn't ready to be home yet. She said sometimes you take the long way and end up somewhere useful. She left before dark. I watched her car back down the drive and turn toward the county road, and I stood on the porch for a moment in the cold, and then I went inside and stood in the kitchen looking at Paula Hess's card on the shelf above the sink. 7 days later Harlan called. His voice had the deliberate quality it gets when he has decided something and is now managing the execution. He said he wanted to come down, bring the boys, that they needed to talk about some things. I said of course. I put the phone down and stood in the kitchen and looked at the seed catalog on the counter, and at the card on the shelf, and I thought about what Caroline had said about protecting what was mine. Then I went up to the Springhouse and I sat in the cold stone room on the wooden stool, and I thought for a long time about Clem, about what he had said on the porch that July, about what he had trusted me to do. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon. All three of them, which I had not been expecting and which told me this was not a casual visit. Mitchell drove. Harlan had flown into Knoxville and Mitchell had collected him from the airport. Dale came from Nashville in his own car and pulled up 20 minutes after the others. They were in the kitchen by 2 o'clock, and there were folders on my table before I had finished pouring the coffee. The folders were from a Knoxville firm, Abernathy & Cole, which I knew by reputation as a practice that handled agricultural estate transfers and property consolidations for larger landowners in the region. I could read the letterhead from where I stood at the counter. I carried the 4 mugs to the table, set them down, and sat in my chair. Harlan started. He said they had been talking, the 3 of them, for some time about the situation at the farm. He said the word situation the way careful people use it when they mean something more specific but don't want to say the specific thing yet. He said the farm was not sustainable in its current form, which was partially true and more complicated than he was making it sound. He said the production had been declining for several years, which was true. He said the equipment costs were outpacing the income from what the land was generating, which was also true. He said they had concerns about my safety and well-being living alone on a property this size, and he said it with the practiced warmth of a man who had rehearsed the line and knew how it landed, as care rather than as the instrument of leverage it actually was. He said they had worked with the attorney to prepare a plan. The plan was a property transfer. The deed would be rewritten to put the land in their names jointly. I would retain the right to live in the house for my lifetime. He said those words carefully, for your lifetime, as if they were a gift rather than the bare minimum of what a son should offer his living mother. The outbuildings, the equipment, the fields, the water rights, the woodlet, all of it would transfer immediately upon signing. The document was already drafted. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now let's get back to the story. I looked at the transfer document when Harlan slid it across the table. I read it the way I read any document, completely and from the beginning. The Springhouse was on page 3, listed in the schedule of improvements. Springhouse structure and associated water rights, northeast quadrant, creek frontage. Listed with everything else. Valued at essentially nothing, a secondary agricultural outbuilding, noted for tax purposes. I asked them if they had discussed this with me before preparing it. Harlan said they had been discussing the farm's financial situation for over a year. I said that wasn't what I asked. Dale said they'd been trying to protect the asset before the situation deteriorated further. Mitchell looked at his coffee. I told them I would need time to review the documents with my own attorney. Harlan started to explain the timeline. He said the property taxes were due in the fall, and that acting before then would allow the new ownership to consolidate the tax burden more efficiently. He said it in a few different ways, the same point recycled with slightly different language, the way a person does when they want the math to substitute for the conversation. I asked them specifically about the Springhouse. Dale said it was a secondary structure, largely irrelevant to the farm's operational value, included in the transfer as part of the overall parcel. He said it without interest, the way you mention a line item that doesn't affect the total. I asked if any of them had been in the Springhouse recently. Mitchell looked up from his coffee. Not at me, at Dale. Harlan said it was a storage building, that the real value was in the acreage and the working equipment. He moved on quickly to the tax calculation, running numbers he'd clearly prepared before arriving, the per acre assessment and the current market comparable for land of this type in the county. I listened to the numbers. I had learned years ago, through 48 years of marriage to a man who was not unkind but who was certain about things the way men of his generation were raised to be certain, that the person who controls the numbers controls the room. Harlan had arrived in my kitchen with an entire architecture of numbers, and that architecture was designed to make the transfer look like inevitability rather than choice. Like math rather than an act of taking. I had a number of my own, but it was not in the folder. I asked about the water rights. Specifically, whether the transfer included the water rights associated with the creek frontage on the northeast property line. Harlan looked at his document. He said yes, those were included, standard in a parcel transfer of this kind. I asked if any of them understood what those water rights covered in practical terms, what access they provided to the creek flow and its downstream uses. Dale said it was standard riparian rights, nothing unusual. I said yes. I said nothing else. I let the yes sit there while Harlan returned to his timeline and Dale examined a listing on his phone of comparable land sales in adjacent counties, and Mitchell continued looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man attending a meeting he had not fully agreed to attend. I noted Mitchell's expression. I had always noted Mitchell's expressions. He was the son who showed you things without intending to, the way still water shows you what's above it. What I saw in his face that afternoon was not the satisfaction of the other two. It was something more complicated, something I could not fully read but which I thought might be the beginning of a different kind of conversation than the one currently happening at my kitchen table. I filed that thought away. I said I needed to make a phone call and I excused myself to the back porch. The card was still in my coat pocket from where I'd put it that morning. Paula Hess answered on the second ring, brisk and professional, surprised to hear from me. I said I was ready to have the conversation. She said she could come Thursday. I said Thursday was not good, could we make it Friday? She said Friday was fine, she'd bring her partner. I said I'd have coffee ready. I went back inside. I told my sons I would have the documents reviewed by the end of the week, and that I'd be in touch before the weekend. Harlan started to press the timeline again. I looked at him the way I used to look at all three of them when they were boys and had tracked mud across a floor I just washed. A look that required no words and never had, and he stopped. They left that evening. Dale said goodbye from the driveway, already checking his phone. Harlan gave me a careful hug that communicated exactly how sure he was of the outcome. Mitchell was last out the door, and he paused on the porch step with his hand on the railing and looked at me with something in his face that might have been the beginning of something worth saying. I waited. He pressed his mouth together and nodded once and walked to his car. I watched the taillights until they turned onto the county road and disappeared into the dark. Then I put on my barn coat and picked up the flashlight from the hook by the door and walked up through the back field in the dark, up the hillside to the Springhouse. I opened the white oak door and stepped inside and closed it behind me and stood in the cold dark for a moment before I turned the flashlight on. The shelves held 23 wheels at various stages. Some wrapped in cloth, some waxed, some bare-rind and developing their character in the still, consistent air. 5 composition notebooks in the wooden crate. The copper equipment on its hooks in the back room. The creek water running in its channel beneath my feet, unchanged by whatever was happening in my kitchen. Unchanged by any of it, doing the thing it had been doing since 1922. I shone the flashlight on the date scratched into the east wall. 1922. LV. The small cross. Luther Voss had built this room out of nothing, out of a hillside and a creek and fieldstone he'd gathered himself, and he'd built it to keep things cold and safe, and it had done exactly that for 103 years without complaint, without fanfare, without anyone outside this property knowing what it was or what it had become. I thought about the Tuesday morning tribunal, about Harlan's folders and the careful architecture of numbers inside them, about Dale's smooth professional certainty in Mitchell's face, the thing I'd seen there, the thing that wasn't certainty at all, about the line on page 3 of the transfer document. Springhouse structure and associated water rights, northeast quadrant, creek frontage, valued at essentially nothing. An afterthought. A secondary agricultural outbuilding listed for tax purposes. They had walked through my kitchen, spread their papers on my table, accounted for every acre and every piece of equipment and every structure on this property, and they had seen the Springhouse for exactly what they assumed it was, which was nothing, an old stone room beside a creek, the kind of thing you list in a transfer because you are required to list everything and move on. They had not asked what was inside it. They had not thought to ask because they had already decided the answer. And the answer they had decided on told them the question wasn't worth asking. That is how it always works with the things people undervalue. Not malice exactly. Assumption. The assumption that what you have not looked at closely enough to understand must not be worth looking at closely. The assumption that the woman who stayed, who managed, who kept things running through the hard years, did nothing during those years that required the kind of attention you'd give to something that mattered. I sat on the wooden stool with the flashlight balanced on my knee, and I looked at the 5 notebooks in the wooden crate. A decade of records. Every culture maintained. Every batch documented. The temperatures and the humidity readings and the turning schedules and the tasting notes in my cramped shorthand. The accumulated knowledge of 10 years of learning a craft and the accumulated character of 10 years of aging cheese in a specific place that could not be duplicated because the specific place did not exist anywhere else. Paula Hess had said the right buyer would understand immediately. Caroline had said whoever ended up with this Springhouse ended up with considerably more than stone and creek water. I thought about Clem on the porch in the July heat, about what he'd said about trust, about the particular kind of trust that doesn't require explanation because it is complete. I thought about the card on the shelf above the kitchen sink. Paula Hess, on her card, described herself as a specialty food broker and regional artisan consultant. 2 lines below that, a phone number. Friday morning. Paula Hess and her partner were coming Friday morning. My sons thought they had 3 days to wait out a 71-year-old woman in an empty farmhouse before she signed papers she didn't understand. I thought about what 3 days looked like from the inside of a Springhouse that had been quietly building its own answer for 10 years. I turned off the flashlight. I sat in the complete dark and the complete cold and listened to the creek water running beneath the floor, the sound it had been making since before I arrived on this property, the sound it would make long after all of us were gone. Then I stood, folded the flashlight under my arm, and walked back down the hill to the house to start planning in earnest. Paula Hess arrived on Friday morning at 9 o'clock exactly, which told me something about her. People who arrive exactly on time are neither the people who arrive early, who want to demonstrate eagerness, nor the people who arrive late, who want to demonstrate that their time is more valuable than yours. Exactly on time is a professional statement. It says I respected the appointment and I expect you to be ready. She was in her mid-50s, compact, with the kind of practical energy that some women develop when they have spent decades in rooms where they had to be twice as prepared as everyone else to be taken half as seriously. She wore a good coat and sensible boots and carried a leather portfolio that had clearly been used for years. Behind her was her business partner, a man named David Oakes, 10 years younger, who shook my hand with both of his and said he was glad I'd called. I had coffee ready and biscuits from the tin and I put them on the table and we sat down. Paula opened her portfolio and I saw a folder with my name on the tab. She had prepared for this meeting. She had been preparing for this meeting since the first time she'd sat across from me 3 years ago, and I'd sent her away without a yes or a no. She said she wanted to be direct with me. She said she'd been thinking about what I had here since that first visit, and that the passage of time had not changed her assessment, it had strengthened it. She said the regional market for high-quality Farmstead cheese had grown considerably in the past 3 years, and that the segment of that market interested in the kind of provenance story my operation represented, the historic structure, the water source, the decade of developed cultures and aging protocols, that segment was not merely growing but was in the process of becoming something that serious buyers in the food industry were actively pursuing. I asked her what she meant by serious buyers. She looked at David. He opened a folder of his own. There was a group, he said, a food investment partnership based out of Asheville that had been quietly acquiring interests in high-provenance artisan producers in the Appalachian region for the past 4 years. They did not acquire the businesses outright. He was careful to say this. They structured partnerships. The producer retained their operation and their methods and their intellectual property, by which he meant my cultures, my recipes, my aging protocols, the knowledge in those 5 composition notebooks. The partnership provided capital investment, distribution infrastructure, and marketing resources. In exchange, they held a minority interest in the production output. I asked what kind of capital investment we were discussing. David told me. I sat with the number for a moment. I want to be careful about how I say what came next because I don't want this to sound like a story about money because it is not a story about money. It is a story about what a woman builds when no one is watching, and about what happens when someone finally looks. But the number David said was not a small number, and I want you to understand that clearly, because the size of it is relevant to understanding what my sons had decided to sign away on page 3 of their transfer document without ever having asked what was inside the building they were signing away. I asked Paula how confident she was in that figure. She said she had spoken with the Asheville partnership already. Informally, without my knowledge, which she acknowledged and apologized for. She said she had described my operation to them without identifying the property, and they had expressed significant interest and given her a preliminary range. The figure David had mentioned was the bottom of that range, not the top. I looked at the window. The lower field was still and pale in the April morning, the frost not yet fully lifted, the creek visible through the woodlet as a dark line between the bare trees. I thought about Harlan's folder on my kitchen table, about the line on page 3. Springhouse structure and associated water rights, valued at essentially nothing. I asked them what the next step would look like. Paula said the partnership would want to visit the property. They would want to see the Springhouse, the aging environment, review my production records, taste the current inventory. She said she had no doubt, zero doubt, about what their response would be when they walked through that door, because she had been in specialty food long enough to recognize when something was genuinely rare. She looked at me steadily when she said this. She said, "Loretta, I have tasted a great many Farmstead cheeses. Yours is different in ways that matter to the people who know what they're looking at." I told her about my sons. I told her about the Tuesday meeting, the folders, the transfer documents. I told her about the timeline Harlan had described. Paula set down her pen. David closed his folder. I said I was telling them because they needed to understand the situation fully before we went any further. I said the Springhouse was currently listed as part of a property transfer my sons were attempting to execute. I said I had not signed anything. I said the property was in my name and I had every legal right to make independent decisions about it. But I said I thought they deserved to know the context. Paula was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you have an attorney?" I said I had a call in to Gerald Huff in Maryville, who had handled Clem's estate. She said, "With respect, I'd recommend calling someone who specializes in agricultural property and business formation." She looked at David again, and he wrote a name on the back of his card and slid it across the table to me. Rebecca Tate, the card said. A Knoxville firm. Agricultural and rural business law. I looked at the name. I looked at my hands on the table, the hands that had been making cheese in that Springhouse for 10 years, that had turned wheels and maintained cultures and kept records in the careful shorthand of someone who understood that precision was not caution but respect for the work. I said I would call her today. Paula said good. She said she would set the property visit for the following Thursday if that worked for me. She said she would contact the Asheville partnership and tell them to clear their calendars. She said, "I want you to understand something clearly, Loretta. What you have built in that Springhouse is not a side project. It is a business that has been operating for a decade without the infrastructure to match its quality. And that gap between what it is and what it has the capacity to become is exactly where real value lives." They left at 11. I stood on the porch and watched Paula's car back down the drive with the same careful precision with which she had arrived. And then I went inside and I sat at the kitchen table in the chair across from Clem's empty one and I looked at the seed catalog on the counter. Then I picked up the phone and called Rebecca Tate. She answered her own phone, which surprised me. I told her my name. I told her David Oakes had given me her number. I told her I needed advice on an agricultural property matter and a potential business formation matter, and that there was some time pressure involved. She said she had a cancellation at 3 o'clock if I could come to Knoxville. I said I'd be there. I drove the 62 miles to Knoxville on a road I knew well, the same road I'd driven 100 times with Clem in those final years, to appointments at the University Hospital, to the specialist on Cumberland Avenue, through the long season of management and slow losing. I knew every curve of it, every gas station and pull-off and the particular bend where the road drops toward the river, and you can see the ridge line to the east going blue with distance on clear days. I drove it now with a different feeling in my chest than I'd ever driven it with before. Something that was not quite what I'd call hope, because hope is a thing that depends on outcomes, and what I felt didn't depend on anything. It was more like clarity. The kind that comes when you stop keeping a secret you've been keeping so long you forgot it was a secret. I thought about the years. Not in a mournful way, not the way you think about lost time. More the way you think about a long piece of work that took the shape it took because of the specific conditions it grew in. And you look back and see that none of it was wasted, that the quiet years and the unwitnessed labor and the 5 notebooks full of careful shorthand were not a detour but the main thing. The whole point, the accumulated mass that was about to make its own weight felt. I had not told anyone in my family what I'd built in that Springhouse except by implication, by the act of going up there day after day, and year after year, and none of them had thought to ask what I was going to, which is a choice people make without knowing they're making it. You decide a person is a certain size and then you stop looking for evidence that you've measured wrong, and after enough years the not looking becomes invisible to you, becomes just the shape of things. Clem had known. Clem had eaten everything I'd made and paid attention the way he paid attention to anything he valued, with the specific focused quality of a man who understood that real things deserved real regard. He had asked questions. He had come up to the Springhouse on Sunday afternoons sometimes and sat on the stool while I worked and watched without commenting, the way you watch someone doing something well when what you feel is too large for commentary. He had told Gerald Huff to list the Springhouse by name in the will. He hadn't known what it would become. He had known it was mine. Rebecca Tate was 43, brisk, with the specific intelligence of someone who had spent 20 years understanding how land and money and family intersect in ways that the law both enables and complicates. She had grown up on a farm 2 counties east of mine. She knew the landscape I was describing not as abstraction but as something she had walked. She listened to all of it without interrupting. The Springhouse, the cheesemaking, the 10 years of it, the notebooks, Paula, Hess, the Asheville partnership, my sons, the Tuesday meeting, the folder, page 3. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone formulating a response, but the quiet of someone making sure they had the complete picture before they began drawing. She said, "Your name is on the deed." I said yes. She said, "Your husbands will transfer the entire property to you unconditionally." I said yes. She said, "And you have not signed anything." I said I had not. She said, "Then the situation is straightforward from a legal standpoint. The property is yours. A transfer document prepared by your son's attorney has no force until you execute it. You are under no obligation to execute it." I told her Harlan had been pressing a timeline. She said his timeline has no legal standing. The property tax due date is a real constraint on whoever owns the property, which is currently you, but it does not require you to transfer ownership to anyone on your son's schedule or anyone else's. I asked about the business formation side. She leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the desk. She said that was the more interesting part of the conversation. She said she had worked with a few producers who had entered into arrangements with the Asheville group Paula mentioned. She knew their structure well. She said the arrangement was fair and well designed, that they were principled partners who understood the value of what they were acquiring interests in and were careful not to disrupt the things that made those operations valuable. She said, "If you're asking me whether what Paula Hess described is legitimate and whether the figure they quoted is realistic, the answer to both questions is yes." I sat with that. She said, "The question I'd ask you is whether you want to do this. Not whether you can. Whether you want to." I told her I had been making cheese in that Springhouse for 10 years. I told her about keeping the notebooks, about the culture maintenance, the aging protocols, the specific work of building something careful and slow in a place that had been built to sustain exactly that kind of patient work. I told her about Clem on the porch and what he'd said about trust. She listened. I said I had not planned any of this. I had not planned Caroline's arrival or Paula Hess's third visit or the Tuesday meeting with my sons that had moved something in me from resigned to decided. I said I had kept the Springhouse quiet for a decade, and what I had kept quiet had kept growing anyway, the way things do when they have the right conditions, and that now the conditions had changed, and it seemed to me that the right response to conditions changing was not to pretend they hadn't. Rebecca Tate looked at me for a moment. She said, "All right, let's build this properly." I drove back to the farm in the last of the afternoon light with a folder of documents she had begun preparing before I left her office and a list of things to gather. The composition notebooks, my production records, documentation of the cultures and their provenance, photographs of the Springhouse, the water quality reports I had requested from the county extension office 3 years ago out of curiosity, and kept in the file cabinet in the spare bedroom. I also had something else. Rebecca had prepared 2 documents for me to review before signing. The first was a letter to Abernathy and Cole, my son's attorneys, formally notifying them that the property owner was engaging independent counsel, and that no transfer would be executed pending that counsel's review of all proposed documents. The second was a draft of what she called an operating agreement template, the foundation for the business entity that would hold the Springhouse operation, its assets, its intellectual property, and its future production rights separately from the land deed, separately from anything my sons could argue should pass through a property transfer. The Springhouse and everything in it, formally and legally constituted as a business that I owned. I signed the notification letter in the parking lot of Rebecca Tate's building with the engine running, and her assistant as my witness. It would be faxed to Abernathy and Cole that afternoon. Driving home I called Darlene. She was 3 days a week at my kitchen and had been for 4 years, and there was very little about my life she hadn't observed in that time. The way people who come into your house regularly and help with the ordinary labor of living observe things that friends and family, who visit on schedules and occasions, tend to miss. She had seen me go up to the Springhouse in all weathers. She had brought me coffee up there once on a January morning when I'd been there since before dawn dealing with a temperature issue. She had carried the composition notebooks down to the kitchen table on evenings when I was cross-referencing batches, and she had never once asked what was in them, not from incuriosity but from the particular tact of someone who understands that some people's work is private not because it's secret but because it's theirs. When I told her what had happened, what was happening, the Tuesday meeting with my sons, Rebecca Tate, the Asheville partnership, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, it's about time." The way she said it was so matter-of-fact that I almost laughed. I asked her what she meant. She said, Loretta, I have been watching you go up that hill for 4 years, and whatever you're doing up there is serious work, and serious work doesn't stay quiet forever. Finds its way out. I told her I wasn't sure I'd planned for it to find its way out quite this fast. She said, good things don't wait for your plan. They just happen when the conditions are right. That was Darlene. She had a quality of practical wisdom that didn't announce itself, just appeared when you needed it, like good drainage in a field you hadn't thought to worry about. I called Harlan from the car on the way home. He answered on the second ring the way people answer calls they have been waiting for and want to control the terms of. I said I wanted him to know I'd engaged independent counsel to review the transfer documents, and that I'd be in touch once that review was complete. I kept my voice the same volume and temperature it was when I told him dinner was on the table when he was 12. Matter of fact. Already decided. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mom, we've already been through all of this. I said I understood. I said I would be in touch. He said, the attorney costs aren't necessary, we've already had everything reviewed. This is just adding complication to a simple process. I said I appreciated that and that I would be in touch. He tried one more time. He said, can we just talk about this? Come up this weekend. I said I was busy this weekend. He was quiet again. This was a new quiet. Not the impatient pause between one argument and the next, but something more uncertain. I waited it out. He said, what are you doing? I said I was taking care of some things. Then I said goodbye and I put the phone down on the passenger seat and I drove home. Harlan called again that evening. I let it ring. Dale called at 9 o'clock. I let that ring too. Mitchell sent a text message which was unusual. Said, Mom, can we talk? Just us. I looked at the text for a while. I typed back, not yet. Soon. Then I went to the Springhouse with a lantern and the first 2 of the composition notebooks, and I began making the inventory Paula had asked for, going through every wheel on the shelves and recording its age, its development stage, its estimated market readiness. It took until nearly midnight. My hands were cold by the end. The lantern threw warm light against the stone walls and the shadows moved when the lantern swayed, and there was something in the quality of the light in that room, the orange warmth of it against the gray stone, that made it look the way it had always looked in my mind even in full daylight, like a place that had been made for something worth making. I had started with the oldest wheels, the ones that had been on the back shelf since October, 6 months in, and worked forward through the inventory by age. Each wheel I recorded in the notebook: date pressed, culture batch used, current weight, rind condition, any notes on development anomalies. It was the same record keeping I had done for 10 years, the same shorthand, the same attention to the small variables that separated a good aging cheese from an exceptional one. The work itself was unchanged. Only the stakes around it had shifted. Around 10 o'clock the spring peeper started up in the bottom field, the first of the year, which meant the ground temperature had finally come up enough and the season was turning for Real. I could hear them through the stone walls, faint but clear. The sound that meant winter was done and the farm was reorienting itself toward growth. I had always loved that sound. Clem used to say the peepers were the farm's own calendar, that you didn't need a date to know when spring had actually arrived. You just waited for the peepers and trusted them. I sat on the stool with my notebook and listened to them through the stone, and I thought about what Clem would have made of all of this. The partnership, the capital, the lawyers in 2 cities, his wife sitting in the Springhouse at 11 o'clock at night making an inventory for a food investment company from Asheville. I thought he would have found it funny, not at me but with me, the way he always found things funny that were also serious, the humor of it not diminishing the gravity but coexisting with it, the way it does in real life when you are actually paying attention. I thought he would have said, well. And then he would have looked at the shelves and the notebooks and the creek channel in the floor, and he would have said, you built a good thing in here, Loretta. I always knew you would. It took until nearly midnight. My hands were cold by the end. I thought about what it meant to build something over 10 years in a room no one else had looked inside. To maintain it through grief and through difficulty and through the ordinary relentlessness of a farm in its aging years. To keep 5 notebooks of careful records, not because anyone required it but because you understood that what you were doing deserved that kind of attention. I thought about what my sons had seen when they looked at the farm. Acreage, equipment, structures, water rights, a tax burden, a transfer opportunity. A 71-year-old woman they loved in the way men love their mothers when love and management have become confused in their minds, which is to say they loved me in the form of worrying about my situation rather than asking about my life. They had not asked about my life in a long time. They had asked about the tractor and the roof and whether Darlene was still coming 3 days a week. They had asked whether I was managing. They had never asked what I was doing in the Springhouse that kept me up there for hours on a cold afternoon in March. They had never asked because the answer they assumed was nothing in particular. Old woman, old building, old habit. That assumption was going to cost them something. Not because I wanted it to. I want to be clear about that. I am 71 years old and I have survived enough to know that vindication is not a warm feeling. It is a cold one. The satisfaction of being proved right after being dismissed is nothing like the satisfaction of being understood in the first place. And I would have traded the whole of what was coming for a single conversation years earlier, where one of my sons had walked up to the Springhouse on a Tuesday afternoon and knocked on the door and said, "Mom, what are you doing in there?" But that conversation had not happened. And the conversation that had happened instead was 3 men in my kitchen with folders from a Knoxville attorney, and a timeline they'd decided without me. So I sat at the kitchen table with my notebooks and my lantern and I let the plan continue to take shape. The plan that wasn't revenge and wasn't vindication and wasn't any of the sharp-edged things people do when they've been wronged and want the world to know it. It was something quieter than that. It was just the natural conclusion of 10 years of patient work finally being given the room to show what it had become. Thursday came the way Thursday always comes after a week of preparation. Too fast and not fast enough at the same time. I was up at 4:30. I turned the Springhouse temperature sensors, I checked the humidity readings, I did the things I always did in the morning with the particular care of someone who understood that the work did not pause for the people who came to witness it. Paula Hess arrived at 9 with David Oakes and 2 people I had not met before. One was a woman named Sylvie Barrow, late 40s, French-educated from the way she spoke about the cheeses, who was a cheesemaker and technical consultant to the Asheville Partnership. The other was a man named Tom Garrett, the partnership's founding partner, quiet, mid-60s, with the unhurried quality of someone who had been in business long enough to know that urgency is almost always a performance. I made coffee. I put the biscuits out. Sylvie tasted one and asked what fat I used in the dough, and we spent 10 minutes talking about lard versus butter, while Tom Garrett looked at the kitchen and the window and the field beyond it with the expression of someone reading something he finds interesting. Then I took them up to the Springhouse. I had not prepared it for their arrival. I want that to be clear. I had not cleaned it beyond what I always kept it, which was clean, or arranged the shelves beyond how I always kept them, which was organized. I had not done anything to make it look like more than it was. I had simply kept it the way I always kept it because the way I always kept it was the point. Sylvie walked through the door and stopped. She stood in the entrance for a long moment without speaking. Then she walked slowly to the first shelf and bent to look at the rinds of the oldest wheels, the ones that had been aging since last October, 6 months in the stone cave. The rinds developed with the particular character that a specific aging environment produces and no other. She did not touch them. She just looked with the focused attention of someone reading a text in a language they know well. She turned and looked at the creek channel in the floor. "Constant flow?" she asked. "Year-round," I said. "Same temperature in July as in January." She looked at the back wall, at the stone and the mortar and the natural moisture that came through the hillside and created the humidity that I had learned to manage rather than fight. She said something in French under her breath, quietly to herself. Then she looked at Paula Hess. Tom Garrett was standing near the door looking at the composition notebooks in the wooden crate. He was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that is full rather than empty. He had not said very much since arriving at the house, not from disinterest but from the habit of someone who has learned that the most useful information in any situation comes from watching before speaking. He had looked at the kitchen and the window and the field and the drive up through the woodlet with that reading quality of attention, taking in the physical character of the place the way you take in the character of a person before you form an opinion. Now he looked at the crate of notebooks for a long moment. He looked at me and asked if he could look at one. I said yes. He lifted the most recent one out of the crate with both hands, which I noticed, the two-handedness of it, the unconscious care you extend to things you already recognize as worth caring for. He opened it and read. He turned pages with the deliberateness of someone reading something important rather than browsing. He looked at the production records, the temperature logs, the culture notes, the tasting observations in my shorthand. He spent time on the batch from last October, the one that was now 6 months into aging on the back shelf. He closed the notebook and set it back in the crate with both hands. He looked at me for a moment with the specific expression of someone who has been in business long enough to have learned to be careful about what they say when the thing in front of them is genuinely surprising. He said, "How long have you been doing this?" I said, 10 years and some months. He said, "And you haven't been selling?" I said, "Not commercially. I given it away, traded it occasionally, kept what I used myself." He looked at the shelves. He looked at Sylvie, who had returned from the back room where the copper equipment was kept, and who was standing near the aging shelves with the expression of someone who has confirmed something they came hoping to confirm. They looked at each other the way colleagues look at each other when the situation is better than either of them had allowed themselves to expect. He looked at me. He said, "Do you know what you have here?" I thought about Caroline on the hillside asking me almost the same question in March, and about what I'd said then, and about how much had changed between that answer and this one. I said, "I'm beginning to understand it fully." He nodded. He said, "Good." Then he said, "Get the lawyers on the phone," and he said it to Paula, and she was already reaching for her phone before the sentence was finished. What happened in the following 3 weeks moved faster than anything I had experienced since the frantic final months of Clem's illness, when every day required a new kind of decision and none of the decisions were small. The Asheville partnership, whose formal name was Ridgeline Artisan Partners, moved with the efficient speed of people who have found what they were looking for, and don't want to lose it to a competing offer that doesn't exist yet. Rebecca Tate's office and Ridgeline's legal team worked through the business structure together over 2 long calls, and a full day of back and forth that Rebecca summarized for me each evening with the patient clarity of someone who understood that her job was not just to do the legal work but to make sure her client understood every decision they were making. The structure that emerged was this: a limited liability company, Voss Springhouse, registered in Tennessee, in which I held 60% and Ridgeline held 40%. The LLC owned the Springhouse operation, the equipment, the cultures, the production protocols, all 5 composition notebooks and their contents, and the exclusive licensing rights to use the Springhouse aging environment for the production of cheese bearing the Voss name. The land itself remained in my name, deeded to me from Clem, with a long-term lease agreement giving Voss Springhouse exclusive access to the Springhouse structure and the creek water rights attached to it. The land my sons wanted to acquire through their transfer document would, if they eventually received it through any legitimate means, include a Springhouse that was locked under a 50-year lease to a company I owned 60% of. They could acquire every acre of the farm. They could have the house and the bottom fields and the woodlot and the tractor and the equipment shed. They could have all of it. The Springhouse was not available. The Springhouse was already spoken for. Ridgeline's capital investment came in 2 tranches. The first, on signing of the partnership agreement, was substantial enough to pay off every outstanding expense on the farm including the deferred drainage work on the lower field, to replace the aging tractor with a new one, and to set aside what Rebecca called an operating reserve in my personal account that would have made Clem laugh with the uncomplicated pleasure he had when things worked out correctly. The second tranche was contingent on the first production season under the partnership, tied to output targets that Sylvie Barrow and I had set together over a full day in the Springhouse with her technical notes and my composition notebook spread across the cutting board. Sylvie Barrow. I want to tell you about Sylvie, because she is part of this story in a way that matters to me, and that I did not anticipate. She came back the Monday after the Thursday visit, alone this time with a small bag and the intent to spend the day working with me rather than evaluating me. She had the quality that the very best technical people have, the ability to move between authority and collaboration without confusion about which mode they're in. When she was evaluating something, she was clear-eyed and precise, and did not soften her assessments to spare feelings. When she was working alongside someone, she was a genuine partner, curious about your methods, respectful of your knowledge, interested in what you'd learned through your particular years of experience in your particular place. She was trained in France in the Auvergne, where the great aged mountain cheeses come from, the ones that take a year or more to develop and require the specific conditions of a stone cave at a specific altitude with specific air and specific water. She spoke about those environments with the affection of someone describing a place they had loved and left. She had spent 15 years working in those European caves and another 10 in the United States, first in Vermont and then moving south and east, looking for producers who had the combination of physical environment and skilled attention that real traditional cheesemaking required. She told me she had found fewer than a dozen. We spent that Monday working through my production protocols together, comparing my methods to the technical framework she'd developed over 20 years, finding the places where they aligned and the places where I'd arrived at solutions through intuition and observation that formal training would have taught as principles. She said more than once, "That's exactly right," and she said it each time the way you say something that is simply accurate, without condescension and without surprise, just the clean acknowledgement of fact. In the late afternoon she sat on the stool with my most recent composition notebook, and read through the last 3 years of batch records with the careful attention she brought to everything. She read for a long time. She asked me about 2 specific batches where my notes indicated something unusual in the rind development. I explained what I'd observed and what I'd done about it. She nodded and made a small note of her own. She closed the notebook and looked at the shelves. She said, "You have made some mistakes in here." I could tell she was not trying to diminish anything. She was giving me the honest version of what she saw. She said the moisture management in the second year had been inconsistent, that 3 batches from that period showed signs of it in their development. She said the culture selection for the softer styles could be refined, that she had cultures she'd been working with for years that might interact interestingly with the specific microbiology of this environment. She said all of this and then she said, "And none of that changes what I said this morning. What you have built here, with the tools you had and the knowledge you developed alone, is exceptional work. The mistakes are the record of learning. The results are the record of what the learning produced." I thought about Clem eating the first successful wheel of aged cheddar I'd made, back when the outcome was still surprising me, and the way he'd looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "Well, you found your thing." He said it simply. He meant it completely. I told Sylvie that. She listened and she smiled and she said he was right. Harlan called again that week. And the week after. I answered on the 3rd call, the one that came on a Wednesday evening, because I was ready to answer it and because I had learned over many decades that the right time to have a hard conversation is when you are prepared for it and not a moment before. He said he needed to understand what was happening. He said Gerald Huff had confirmed that I'd engaged outside counsel, and that Abernathy and Cole had received the notification letter. He said the attorney had called him that afternoon and that the call had been, his word, unexpected. I said I imagined it had been. He said he was confused. He said he was worried about me. He said the phrasing carefully, working to keep it warm, and I gave him credit for that. Harlan was not a cruel man. He was a man who had decided what was practical and had organized his thinking around that decision so completely that the thinking had become invisible to him, had become just the shape of how things were. He genuinely believed he was helping. That was the part that required the most careful response from me because it was partially true, and because the part that was not true was the part he couldn't see. I told him not to worry. He said, "Mom, we were trying to take the burden off you. The farm is a lot for one person and we thought if we handled the financial side you could just focus on the house and have a simpler." I said I hadn't found the farm to be a burden. He was quiet for a moment. He hadn't expected that. He had built his whole model on the assumption that I was struggling under something I needed relief from, and I had just removed the foundation of that model with 8 words. He said, "The finances though, the tax situation, the equipment costs." I said I was managing the finances. He said, "How?" I said I would explain when I was ready. Another pause. Longer this time. He said, "Can we still move forward with the transfer?" I said no. He was quiet. The quality of the quiet was different from any quiet I'd heard from him in years. It was not the organized quiet of a man composing his next point. It was the quieter quiet of a man encountering a wall he hadn't known was there. He said, "What do you mean no?" I said the property was mine, Clem had left it to me, and I had decided how I was going to manage it going forward, and a transfer to the 3 of them was not part of that management plan. He said, "Mom, we're your sons." I said I knew that. He said, "We have a legal right to be involved in decisions about the property." I said, gently and clearly, that he was incorrect about that. I said he could speak with Rebecca Tate if he wanted to discuss the legal details. There was a long pause. Then he said, "What is going on with the Springhouse?" I thought about how long I'd kept the Springhouse. About Caroline on the hillside saying the quiet was going to have to end. About Sylvie in the cold stone room saying we need more capacity, the way you say something that is simply true. I said, "I'll tell you when I'm ready." And I asked him to be patient. He wasn't patient, not entirely, but he held. Dale was less patient. Dale called the next morning and went directly to the language of legal consultation and family rights, and the need for transparency in matters affecting family assets. I let him finish. I said the property was not a family asset. It was my asset. I said I would be in touch when there was something to share. Mitchell texted again. Just us, Mom. When you're ready. I held on to that text for several days. I turned it over the way you turn something over when you're not sure yet what it is. Mitchell had always been the one I watched most carefully. The one whose silences held things rather than hiding them. He had been in my kitchen with the other two when the folders were on the table, had been part of the plan in the way that the person who drives the car is part of whatever happens when you arrive. But he had also been the one who paused on the porch that Thursday evening with his hand on the railing, and something unfinished on his face. He had been the one who had not pressed, in the days since, the way his brothers had pressed. I was not naive about what that meant and what it didn't mean. It did not mean Mitchell was innocent of the plan. It did not mean his presence at the kitchen table was accidental, or that his agreement to the approach had been reluctant in any way that mattered. He had come, he had sat. He had said nothing to contradict what Harlan said. The fact that his silence was a different quality of silence from his brother's certainty did not make it opposition. But I thought about what he might be carrying. I thought about what it costs a person to be the youngest, to be the quiet one, to spend a lifetime translating between the louder presences in a family. I thought about what it might feel like to have agreed to something that then turned into something else, something larger and more complicated than anyone had anticipated, and to be sitting with that in a way you couldn't say out loud without implicating yourself. I thought he deserves an honest conversation. Not absolution. Just the truth of what was in the Springhouse and what it meant, told to him plainly by the person who built it. By the end of the third week, Voss Springhouse LLC was registered with the state of Tennessee. The partnership agreement was signed. The first capital tranche had cleared. Rebecca Tate had filed the lease agreement protecting the Springhouse against any future property transfer. The drainage work on the lower field was contracted and scheduled to begin in May. The new tractor was ordered. I sat at the kitchen table on a Friday evening with a glass of iced tea and a letter that had arrived from Paula Hess on Ridgeline Stationery. It confirmed the partnership terms, the investment figures, the projected first-year production targets. It also included, on the last page, a note from Tom Garrett written by hand in a clean, unhurried script. He wrote, "Mrs. Voss, in 20 years of looking for what you have built, I have found it fewer times than I have fingers to count. The people who built those operations all had one thing in common. They kept going in the years when no one was watching. Please know that what you built in those years is the reason any of this is possible." I read the note twice. I folded it carefully and put it in the wooden crate in the Springhouse beside the composition notebooks, where the things that mattered were kept. Outside the window, the evening light was laying itself across the bottom field in the long gold way it does in April, when the season has finally committed. The lower field was still bare, but the woodlet was greening at the tips of its branches, the first tentative color of a spring that had taken its time arriving. The creek ran where it always ran. The peepers were going in the bottom by the water. The Springhouse sat on the hillside the way it had sat there since 1922, unchanged and unchangeable, doing what it had always done. I sat for a while with all of it, with the letter and the tea and the evening light and the sound of the farm reorienting itself toward growth, with the weight of what the past 3 weeks had been and the particular lightness that comes when a thing you have carried alone for a long time is finally shared. Then I picked up my phone and I texted Mitchell back. "Come Sunday," I said. "I'll put the coffee on." Mitchell came on Sunday as I had asked him to. Not in the early morning the way he came as a boy when he wanted to find me alone before his brothers were up, but at 10 o'clock in the reasonable daylight, and he came alone. I watched his truck pull up the drive from the kitchen window and I noted that he had not called ahead the way he usually did, had not texted a second time after my reply, had simply arrived. The not calling ahead told me something about the quality of the time he'd spent with my text message in the days between my sending it and his arrival at my door. He had not wanted to give me the opportunity to set conditions. He had wanted to show up on the terms of what I'd offered, which was coffee and an honest conversation, and not give either of us the chance to rehearse. That told me more about him than the text had. It told me he had been sitting with something that deserved better than rehearsal. He knocked, though he had grown up in this house and the door was unlocked and I had told him to come in at some point in the past 15 years. He knocked and waited, and when I opened the door he was standing on the porch step with his hands in his coat pockets and the particular look on his face that I had been seeing since he was 7 years old, The one that meant he was carrying something heavy and had been carrying it long enough that setting it down was going to hurt. I said, "Come in." I said, "Coffee's ready." He came in and sat in the chair he'd always sat in, the one on the near side of the kitchen table. Not Clem's chair and not mine, but the third one, the chair that had always been where the children sat when things were being discussed seriously. He sat in it without hesitating, which I thought was either unconscious or deliberate, and I was not sure which, and I poured 2 mugs and set them on the table and sat down across from him. He looked at his hands around the mug for a moment. He said, "Mom." He didn't say anything after that for a beat, just my name, as if he were checking whether it still meant what it had always meant and he wasn't sure of the answer. I said, "Mitchell." He said, "I need you to know something before anything else." I told him to go ahead. He said he had known this was wrong from the beginning. He said it without decorating it, without preamble or softening. He said he had sat in Harlan's car in the parking lot of the Cracker Barrel off the interstate 3 weeks before the Tuesday meeting, when Harlan had laid out the plan for the first time with the folder spread across the hood of the car, and he had known then that it wasn't right and he had not said so. He said he had told himself that the farm was genuinely struggling, which was true, and that someone needed to do something, which was also true, and that he didn't have a better plan, which was the true thing that had cost the most. He had no alternative to offer, and Harlan had an entire folder of alternatives, and the silence that fills the space where your better idea should be is a loud and uncomfortable silence, and he had let Harlan's plan rush into it because it was easier than standing in the discomfort. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they mean it physically, when it costs them something to put the words in the air. I looked at him for a moment. He was 42 years old. He had his father's forehead and his father's quality of stillness, and the same way of looking at a table when he was working through something difficult, as if the surface of it held the answer he was looking for. He had been the one I worried about least because he was the most self-contained, and I had spent years confusing self-containment with being all right, which is an easy mistake to make from the outside. I told him I accepted that. I told him I meant it. Then I told him to come with me. I pulled on my barn coat. He pulled on his. We went out the back door and up through the rear field in the spring morning, which was warmer than any morning had been since October, the kind of warmth that isn't yet summer but has committed to being something other than winter. The bottom field was still pale from the dormancy of the cold months, but there was green at the margins of it, the first tentative green that comes up along the creek bank before the field proper wakes. The drainage contractors were coming the following week, and I could see from the slope of the lower field what the work would do, how the tile installation would redirect the water that currently sat in the northwest corner through February and stunted the yield in that quadrant. I had been looking at that corner for years. It was one of the things you see so consistently that you stop seeing it and accept it as the shape of things. The capital from Ridgeline had made it possible to look at it again as a problem rather than a condition. We walked through the woodlet. The creek was running well, carrying the snowmelt from the ridge in the particular high clear voice it had in April when the volume was up but the mud hadn't thickened it yet. Mitchell and I had walked these woods when he was a boy, on the Sunday mornings when Clem was at church committee meetings and the older boys had their own plans, and Mitchell was the one who was still small enough to want his mother's company without being embarrassed by it. He knew these trees. He had grown up under their specific light. We came up the northeast hillside to the Springhouse. He stopped when he saw it the way people always stopped, not from surprise at the structure itself, which he had seen his whole life, but from something in the air around it, the particular quality of that hillside and that hillside's light in the morning, the creek audible behind the wall, the solidity of the stone against the soft April morning. He had not been here in years. I watched him look at it. I opened the door. He followed me in. The first thing he did when his eyes adjusted to the interior light was look at the shelves. I watched his face move through several things quickly. Recognition that there was more here than a storage space, calculation of what was on the shelves, a specific understanding arriving about the composition notebooks in the crate. He had always been quick. He read rooms the way his father had read weather. He said, "How long?" I told him 10 years and some months. He walked to the first shelf and looked at the wheels without touching them, the way Sylvie had. He was not Sylvie and he did not have her trained understanding of what he was looking at, but he had enough intelligence and enough respect for the thing in front of him to look at it carefully before speaking. He looked for a long time. He read the labels I had written on the cloth wrappings. He looked at the notebooks in the crate. He said, "Can I look at one of those?" I lifted the most recent one and handed it to him with both hands, the same way Tom Garrett had held it, and he received it the same way, with the unconscious care you extend to something you've already recognized as mattering. He opened it. He read the first few pages of batch records, the dates and culture notes and temperature logs, and I watched him understand what the shorthand meant. He had always been the one who paid attention to how I kept things. When he was 12, he had picked up my planting log from the kitchen counter and read it cover to cover with the focused attention of a person who finds the keeping of careful records inherently interesting. He was that person still. He closed the notebook. He looked at the back wall of shelves, the full depth of what was there. He said, and no one knew. I said Clem knew. I said Darlene had observed it without being told. I said a woman named Caroline had come through the Springhouse with me the Saturday before the Tuesday meeting. I said Paula Hess had visited several times. I said what none of them had known until 3 weeks ago was the full scope of it. He looked at me. He said, you had all of this in here and you didn't tell us. I said yes. He said, why? I thought about the various answers to that question and I gave him the honest one. I told him what I'd told Caroline on the hillside. That after Clem died and the farm became something to be managed, a great deal of what I owned had been quietly redefined in my sons' minds as something in transition, as an inheritance waiting to be claimed. That I had watched Harlan begin his inventory, his careful maintenance of the columns, on every Sunday call for 4 years. That I had understood what was being built and I had not known how to name it and so I had not named it. And in the naming gap I had gone up to the Springhouse instead and done the one thing on this property that no one had a prior claim to. He listened. His expression was a complicated one, the kind that holds several feelings without ranking them. He said, that's fair. He said it simply. He said, we gave you reasons not to trust us with it. I said it was more complicated than that. I said trust wasn't precisely the right word for what I hadn't offered them. I told him it was more like privacy. That the Springhouse had been the one thing that was entirely mine in a place where almost everything else had history layered into it from before I arrived. That I had kept it private not out of distrust but out of the specific need that some people have to own something completely, to have a place where no one else's expectations are in the room with you. He nodded slowly. He said, I understand that. I looked at him. I thought he probably did. I told him then about the business. About Voss Springhouse LLC, about Ridgeline Artisan Partners, about Rebecca Tate and the lease agreement and the first capital tranche. I told him about Sylvie Barrow, and the Monday she'd spent working through the production protocols with me. I told him about the drainage contractors and the new tractor. I told him all of it in the same matter-of-fact way I would have told Clem over supper, the same tone I used for things that had been decided and required reporting rather than discussion, and I watched him receive each piece of it with the processing quality he'd had since childhood, the quality of a person who does not need to respond to a thing before he has finished understanding it. When I finished he was quiet for a moment. He looked at the creek channel in the floor, the water running in it with its 40-year constancy. He said, the Springhouse is under a long-term lease. I said 50 years. He said, so if we ever receive the land through, I said yes. The Springhouse operation would remain mine regardless of what happened to the surrounding acreage. The land and the business were legally separated. He absorbed that. He said, Harlan is going to be very upset about this. I said I imagined so. He said, Dale too. I said I knew. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, are you? I said I was ready for it. He said, that's not what I asked. I looked at him. He was right, that was not what he'd asked. I thought about the answer. I thought about what it meant to be 71 years old and the mother of 3 grown men, and to have spent the past 3 weeks executing a plan that would alter the financial expectations of those men significantly, in the particular direction of downward. I thought about Harlan in his house in Knoxville, working through the implications of the notification letter from Abernathy and Cole. About Dale in Nashville, doing the real estate math on $150 million of regional artisan food investment that had been sitting inside a secondary outbuilding he'd dismissed on page 3 of a transfer document. I said I was not glad that they were going to be upset. I said I would have preferred, much earlier, to have been in a conversation rather than an inventory. I said that preferred conversation had not been offered and I had not known how to create it, and so here we were on the other side of the decision rather than the beginning of it. Mitchell said, can I say something you won't like? I said yes. He said, some of this is on you too. He said it carefully, with the care of someone who has thought about whether to say a thing for long enough that saying it finally is both deliberate and a little frightening. He said, "Not the Springhouse. That's yours and it was always yours and we should have asked. That part I'm not talking about. But the farm," he said. "The way we all ended up in your kitchen with folders from a lawyer." He said, "If you told us you were managing. If you told us about the tractor costs and the drainage work and that you had a plan, a real plan." He stopped. He started again. He said, "I know what Harlan's like. I know he was running the numbers without your knowledge and building toward something. But I also sat at that table and what I heard in my own head, before the folders came out, was a farm with no succession plan and a mother who wouldn't talk about it." He stopped again. He said, "I should have knocked on the Springhouse door years ago and asked what you were doing in here. I know that. But I think there might have been a conversation that could have happened earlier between you and us that might have gotten us somewhere better than where we ended up." I sat with that. It was the kind of thing that was true and that I had also thought in the late nights since the Tuesday meeting, in the way you think about the things you might have done differently when the outcome is already determined and the thinking is not remediation but honesty. I had told myself the story of my sons as men who had decided I was a certain size and stopped looking for evidence to the contrary, and that story was true. It was also true that I had not offered them the evidence. That I had chosen privacy in a way that left the field to Harlan's inventory because I had not put anything in the field myself. I told Mitchell he was right. I said I had held the Springhouse close partly out of a genuine need to own something entirely and partly out of something less graceful than that, something that was closer to preemptive protection. That I had known, without forming the knowledge into a specific thought, that once I told them what was in the Springhouse it would become part of the inventory. And I had not wanted it inventoried. And that wanting had calcified into a habit of privacy that had lasted 10 years and had left all of us, in the end, in a more adversarial position than any of us had intended. Mitchell looked at the shelves. He said, "It's extraordinary what you've built in here." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I mean it literally. Not just as a compliment. I mean it as an observation about what 10 years of doing something carefully and with full attention produces." He said, "I work with my hands. I run a landscaping business. I understand what that kind of accumulation looks like and how long it takes and what it asks of a person." He gestured at the shelves, at the notebooks. He said, "This is not a hobby. This is a vocation." I thought about Sylvie saying it is a vocation, and I thought about how two people who had never met each other had landed on the same word from their different approaches, and what that convergence meant. I said it had become one. That I hadn't set out to make it one. That I'd started with a mesophilic starter culture from a neighbor and a copper pot and a curiosity, and the curiosity had turned into study and the study had turned into practice and the practice had accumulated the way practice does when the conditions are right and you don't stop. Mitchell said, "Did it make you happy? The years of it?" No one had asked me that. Not Paula Hess, not Rebecca Tate, not Caroline or Sylvie or Tom Garrett. They had all understood what I had and what it was worth and what it could become, and they had framed their questions accordingly. Mitchell was asking something different. He was asking about the inside of those years, about what the Springhouse had felt like from the inside when no one was watching. I thought about the mornings. The pre-dawn mornings when I'd come up the hillside with a lantern and sat on the stool and done the turning and the temperature checks and the rind assessments in the still cold air while the farm slept around me. The particular quality of that silence. The way the creek sounded in the dark. The smell of the aging room, which I had learned to read the way you read soil, as a complex of information that told you what the environment was doing and what it needed. The years of the notebooks, the filling of them, the satisfaction of keeping a record that was precise and complete and mine. I said yes. I said it had made me very happy. I said it in the simple way without elaboration because the simple way was the right way for that particular truth. He nodded. He looked at his coffee mug, which he was holding with both hands, warming them against the chill of the stone room. He said, "I want to tell you something I haven't said to Harlan or Dale." I waited. He said, when Harlan laid out the plan that day in the parking lot, what he said about the farm's finances was true. What he said about the equipment and the tax situation and the production numbers was all accurate. He said, but when he got to the part about your well-being, about how it was too much for one person, I had a feeling that was different from what Harlan was describing. He said, "I've been out here more than they have. I see you in the morning sometimes when I come early and you don't know I'm coming." He said, "You don't look like a woman who's struggling with too much. You look like a woman who knows exactly what she's doing and is doing it on her own terms. He said, I told myself that feeling was me being sentimental. That the numbers were the numbers and sentiment didn't fix the drainage on the lower field. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I should have trusted the feeling. We stayed in the Springhouse for another hour. I showed him things the way I'd shown Caroline, the culture maintenance, the aging protocols, the record-keeping system. He asked questions that came from genuine curiosity rather than assessment, the questions of a person who works with living systems and knows what sustained attention to them requires. He asked about the microbiology of the aging environment, about whether the specific character of the Springhouse air was something that could be quantified or whether it was the kind of knowledge that lived in observation rather than measurement. I told him Sylvie had asked the same question and that the answer was both, that there were things you could measure and things you had to learn to read, and that the reading was the harder and more interesting part. He asked about the cultures. I opened the cold room where I kept the culture jars and showed him the maintenance process, the feeding schedule, the way I tracked their behavior over time in the notebooks, because a culture that behaved differently from its baseline was telling you something and you had to know its baseline to hear what it was saying. He listened with the focused attention of someone who is storing what they hear, rather than waiting for the opportunity to speak. At one point he reached out and ran his hand along the mortar between two of the lower stones, the same gesture Caroline had made on that March morning, and I thought about what it was in people that made them reach toward old stone. The desire to touch something that had lasted, to make contact with duration. He found Luther Voss's mark on the east wall without my pointing to it. 1922. LV. He stood looking at it for a long time. He said, great-great-grandfather. I said yes. He said, he built this to keep butter cold. I said yes. He said, and now. He looked at the shelves of wheels, at the copper equipment, at the 5 notebooks in the wooden crate. He said it the way you say something when the thing in front of you is larger than the sentence you have for it. I said, and now. We walked back down the hill in the warmer part of the morning. The sun high enough to actually warm the air rather than just color it. The peepers were going in the bottom field. Full morning voice. The sound of a season that had made its decision. I had always loved the peepers. Clem used to say the peepers were the farm's own calendar, and I had told Mitchell that, one of those Sunday mornings in the woodlet when he was young enough to find it interesting rather than familiar, and I watched him now look toward the bottom field with the expression of a person remembering something his body knew before his mind could name it. He said, I need to talk to Harlan and Dale. I said I knew. He said, I don't know how that conversation goes. He said, Harlan is going to see this as you having been deceptive. He's going to make it about that. He said, Dale is going to see it as a financial outcome that went the wrong direction and he's going to manage his feelings about it through the money. I said, and you? He thought about it. He said, I think I see it as my mother spending 10 years building something real in a place no one thought to look, and then protecting it when she had to, and not being wrong to do either of those things. He stopped walking. We were at the edge of the back field. The house visible through the rear screen of bare apple trees that I had never gotten around to replanting after the late freeze took them 7 years back. The field was pale and still and the morning lay over it, the way good light lays over a field that's been managed honestly. He said, I also think you deserved better than what we gave you. I think if we'd been paying the kind of attention we should have been paying, the Tuesday meeting never happens. He said, I'm sorry for my part in it. The whole of my part, from the parking lot to your kitchen table. I told him I heard that. I told him it mattered. We went inside and I made fresh coffee. We sat at the table for another hour and talked about things that were not the Springhouse and not the business and not the transfer documents, things we hadn't talked about in longer than I could precisely recall. He told me about his business, about the difficulty of finding workers who stayed, about a project he was doing at a property in the county, a restoration of a historic formal garden, that had turned into something more interesting than a job. He had the quality, when he talked about work he found engaging, of going slightly still, the excess motion of conversation dropping away until what was left was just the attention of a person for a thing that genuinely held them. His father had had that quality. I had always been glad Mitchell had inherited it. I told him about Sylvie. About the Monday she'd spent in the Springhouse, the way she'd moved through the space, the things she'd said about the microbiology and the terroir quality of the aging environment. I told him about Sylvie's training in the Auvergne, about the great mountain cheeses she'd spent years learning in those French stone caves, and about what she'd said when she looked at my back shelf, the things she'd said in French under her breath that I hadn't understood and hadn't asked her to translate because the tone of it said enough. Mitchell said, "What did you feel when they signed the partnership agreement?" I thought about the morning Rebecca Tate had called to tell me the agreement was fully executed. I had been in the Springhouse doing the morning checks, and I had put the phone down and stood in the center of the room with my hands at my sides and listened to the creak running under the floor, and I had felt something I still had not found precise words for. Not triumph, which was the wrong temperature for it. Not relief, which was too simple. Something that combined the lightness of a thing concluded with the weight of understanding how close it had come to going differently. The thin margin between the woman who signed Harlan's transfer document and the woman who called Rebecca Tate. I told Mitchell it had felt like what Clem used to describe feeling at the end of a harvest. Not happiness exactly. More like the right completion of a necessary effort. The particular satisfaction of a thing done in full. Mitchell smiled at that. He said, "That's a farming feeling." I said I supposed it was. He left at noon. He hugged me at the door, not the careful hug Harlan had given me that Thursday evening, the hug of a man certain of his outcome, but the kind of hug you give when you are not certain of anything except the person in front of you. He held on for a moment. I let him. He said, "I'm going to call Harlan this week." He said, "I don't know if it will help, but I'm going to tell him the truth about what I think." I said that was his to decide and his alone. He said, "I think he deserves to know that it wasn't a deception. That what you did was exactly what Clem trusted you to do." He said it might not land. Harlan is going to want to argue about the financial angle, and he's very good at the financial angle. But I think someone should say it plainly. I said I appreciated that. He walked to his truck. He stopped with his hand on the door and turned back and looked at the farm, the way he'd looked at it from the woodlet that morning, with the reading quality his father had. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the lower field and the woodlet and the ridge behind. Then he said, "It's good land, Mom." I said it was. He got in the truck and backed down the drive and turned onto the county road, and I stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded into the Sunday quiet of the countryside, which was the sound of birds and the far creek and nothing else. Harlan called on Wednesday. I had expected Tuesday, which would have been faster, but I thought Mitchell had probably given him a day or two to sit with whatever he'd said before the call came, and Harlan was a man who processed things by building argument architecture around them, and that took time. He would have spent Monday restructuring his model of the situation, finding the angles, deciding which of the available legal and moral positions had the strongest load-bearing structure. By Wednesday he would have been ready. He was ready. He led with the legal question, which I had expected. He said Rebecca Tate had filed a lease agreement that in his understanding significantly encumbered the property, in a way that had not been disclosed during their original discussion of the transfer. He used the word encumbered twice and disclosed once, and each usage had the precision of someone who had been speaking to their own attorney before making the call. I said the lease agreement was a legal document protecting the business interests of a company I owned, and that the filing was appropriate and standard. He said, "You had this plan before we even came to the house." I said I had made some calls the week before the meeting, yes. He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. Then he said, "You could have talked to us." He said it differently from how he'd said things before, without the smooth certainty of the Tuesday meeting. There was something more open in it, more genuinely confused. I said I could have. I said I was not sure what conversation would have happened if I had. I said I had watched him keep his inventory for 4 years, and I had not seen an opening in those years for a conversation about what was in the Springhouse that wouldn't have immediately become a conversation about its value to the larger estate. He said, "That's not fair." I said, "Harlan, you had a folder of documents from Abernathy and Cole on my kitchen table before I had poured the coffee. You had already spoken to an attorney, established a timeline, and determined a conclusion. That was not a conversation. That was a presentation." He was quiet. A different quality of quiet from the ones I'd heard before. He said, "We were worried about you." I said I believed that. I said worry and respect were different things and they require different actions, and an action that does not consult its subject is not the action of worry but of management. I said I knew the difference between being loved and being managed, and I was entitled to that distinction even when the managing came from people who also loved me. He was very quiet now. I said, "I'm not angry at you. I want you to hear that. I am not telling you this to punish you or to make you feel that you have been outmaneuvered, because if that's how you're hearing it, then something important is being lost." I said, "What I built in the Springhouse is 10 years of my life and my attention and my grief and my joy, And it is now also a business, and I protected it the way you protect things that matter to you. I said you would have done the same. Any one of you would have done the same for something you had spent 10 years building alone. He said you should have told us. I said probably yes. I said I was not without fault in how we arrived here. I said keeping something private for a decade had its own costs and I had paid some of them and the three of them had paid some of them too and none of us were going to arrive at the end of this conversation having given and taken no damage. I said that was all right. I said damage between people who love each other was survivable as long as the love was the larger thing. He said, is it? His voice was lower, quieter, stripped of the architecture. He was just asking. I said yes. I said I hope so. I said that was also his choice as much as mine. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I waited without filling it. He said, I want to see it. The Springhouse. What you have in there. I told him to come Saturday. He came Saturday alone, the way Mitchell had come, which I had not expected. I had thought Harlan might bring his wife, who was a careful and intelligent woman named Susan who I had always liked, and who I thought might have had more reservations about the Tuesday meeting than she'd been in a position to say. But he came alone in his careful car, dressed in the practical clothes he wore when he remembered he was from a farm, and he stood on the porch and shook my hand in the way he had sometimes, as if he were not sure whether the hug was appropriate and had defaulted to professionalism. I put coffee on. We sat at the table. He did not bring a folder. I told him the same things I had told Mitchell. The full history, the decade of it, Caroline, Paula, Hess, Ridgeline, Rebecca, Tate. I told him about the composition notebooks and the cultures and the aging protocols. I told him the investment figure. He did not react to it the way I had expected him to, with the financial person's immediate movement toward analysis. He sat with it the way a person sits with something larger than they had prepared for. He said, the bottom of the range. I said yes. He said, you've been doing this since before Dad died. I said the first few years were just learning. That the business understanding had come later. He said, did he know? I said Clem had known I made cheese in the Springhouse. That he had not known the scale of what it had become, but he had known it was something I was serious about, and he had told Gerald Huff to list the Springhouse by name in the will. Harlan sat with that for a moment. He said, he knew it. Mattered to you? I said yes. He said, and he trusted your judgment about what to do with it. I said he had. I told him about the porch in July, the blue picture, the thing Clem had said about land turning brothers into surveyors. I told it to him the way I told things I'd been saving for the right moment, plainly and without embellishment, because it didn't need embellishment. It was already the truest thing. Harlan looked at the window. The lower field was just visible from where we sat, the bare pale of early April, the green coming in at the edges. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at it the way his father had looked at a field, with the compound attention of someone reading multiple things at once. The drainage, the soil color, the growth at the margins, the year's potential in what was currently not there yet. He said, the drainage work is contracted. I said it started next week. He said, new tractor. I said it would arrive by the end of the month. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been running the numbers on this farm for 4 years. I said I knew. He said, I thought I understood the financial situation. I said I knew that too. He said I was wrong. That was all he said. 3 words, and he said them with the specific effort of a man who does not say them often, who has built a life and a professional identity on the premise that his understanding of a situation is correct, and who has just encountered evidence that the premise had a significant hole in it. He said them without flinching, which cost him something, and I gave him credit for every cent of that cost. I took him up to the Springhouse. He walked through the door and stood for a moment in the entrance and looked at the shelves. He was quiet for longer than Mitchell had been quiet, which I thought was because he was doing more kinds of calculation simultaneously. He was doing what Harlan always did, running the numbers and the structural assessment and the personal reckoning all at once, and each of those processes took time and they were not accustomed to running in parallel with each other. He went to the shelf and looked at the wheels the way the others had looked. He read the labels. He looked at the composition notebooks in the crate without touching them. He found Luther Voss's mark on the east wall and stood looking at it for a moment. He said, 1922. I said yes. He said, he built this before refrigeration existed. I said that was the point of it. I told him about the physics of it, the creek channel and the hillside insulation and the constant 53 degrees, the same as a good wine cave, the temperature at which a class of fungal and bacterial organisms do their best and most complex work on a developing cheese. I told him about the microbiology of the aging environment, the specific organisms in the air of this particular hillside that Sylvie had been excited about, the fact that this combination could not be replicated because you could not pick up a hillside and move it. He listened. He was processing, I could tell, not just hearing but placing each piece of information into the architecture he was building in real time, adjusting the model as each new fact came in. He had always done this. It was what made him good at his work and what made him difficult at holidays. But watching it now, in the cold stone room with the creek running under the floor, it looked different to me than it usually looked. Not like management. Like genuine effort. He said, Paula Hess came here 3 times. I said yes. He said, and you told her no twice. I said I wasn't ready. He said, what made you ready? I thought about how to answer that. I said the Tuesday meeting had moved something in me from resigned to decided. That before his arrival in my kitchen I had been keeping the Springhouse private out of a need to own something fully and a vague preemptive protection. That after his arrival I had understood that the preemptive protection needed to become something more concrete. He nodded slowly. He said, we pushed you into this. I said I would not say it that way. I said the Tuesday meeting had clarified things, not caused them. That the business would have been built eventually regardless, because Paula Hess was not a person who gave up and Ridgeline was not a partnership that failed to see a good thing twice. I said what the Tuesday meeting had done was accelerate my own readiness, had moved the timeline forward and made the protection more urgent. I said I would have preferred to reach this outcome without the adversarial framework, but that the outcome itself was the right one. He said, if we'd known. I said, I've thought about that. He said, I would have helped you protect it. He said it simply. He said, whatever else you think of the Tuesday meeting, I would not have put the Springhouse in the transfer if I'd understood what was in it. I looked at him. He was serious. He was telling me the truth the way Harlan told truths, without softening them but also without using them as weapons. I said, I know that. I said, which is part of what I was protecting it from. Not you wanting to take it. Just the general gravity of things becoming known, being assessed, being assigned value in your columns. I said, once something is on the ledger it is part of the calculation and I was not ready for this to be part of the calculation. He said, that's fair. Then he said something that surprised me. He said, I do that to Susan too. He said it quietly, looking at the creek channel rather than at me. He said, I make her feel like she's on the ledger. She's told me that. He said, I don't mean to. I think I'm just trying to understand the situation and the situation includes the people in it and so they get assessed along with everything else. He said, it's not a generous way to love someone. I sat with that. I said, no. It isn't. I said, it's also not a fatal flaw. I said the people who love you know the difference between being inventoried and being cared for, and they know that both things can come from the same person. He looked at me. He said, do you? I said, yes. I said, you're my son. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm sorry, Mom. For the Tuesday meeting and for the years of Sunday calls that were about the tractor and the roof and never about what you were doing in this building. He said it the same way Mitchell had said his version of it. Simply without decoration, as a statement of fact about himself that he was not going to run from. I told him I accepted it. I told him I meant it. He stood in the Springhouse for a while longer looking at things. He asked about the partnership structure and I explained it the way Rebecca Tate had explained it to me, with the precision of something I'd come to understand fully rather than just received. He asked good questions. He had a good mind for structure and the structure of the LLC was elegant and he could see that it was elegant, and I watched him appreciate it the way a person appreciates a well-designed thing even when the design is not serving their initial interests. He said, Rebecca Tate is good. I said she was excellent. He said, Abernathy and Cole would have caught it eventually if we tried to move forward. I said I thought so. He said, I'm glad it didn't get there. I said I was too. We walked back down the hill and I made soup from what I had, and we ate it at the kitchen table in the early afternoon and talked about Susan and about their daughter, who was finishing her 2nd year of college and had his mathematical intelligence and her mother's charm, which was a combination that was going to take her a long way. I told him things I had been meaning to tell him for months. Not large things but the things that accumulate when you are keeping contact through Sunday calls that are about the tractor and the roof, The woman from Knoxville whose dog had gotten into Roy Pickett's henhouse and the diplomatic complexity of the resolution. Darlene's granddaughter who was learning to read and had sent me a picture of her first written word, the morning in February when I'd found a great horned owl sitting on the fence post by the upper woodlet gate, close enough that I could see the detail of its feathers. Harlan listened. He asked questions. Not assessment questions, just the questions of a person who is paying attention to someone else's life. He left in the mid-afternoon. He hugged me at the door, properly this time, the way you hug a person when the hug is the point and not the punctuation. He said, "Can I come back?" "Not for anything specific," he said. "Just to see the place." I said yes. I said come in the morning early, before the day gets its complications on top of it. I said that was the best time to see what you actually owned. He said, "I'll remember that." He walked to his car. He drove carefully down the drive the way he drove everything, and turned onto the county road, and I watched until he was gone. Dale came 2 weeks later on a Thursday on his own schedule and without being asked, which surprised me. He called Tuesday morning, voice smooth in the professional register he defaulted to when he was approaching something he found uncomfortable, and asked if he could come Thursday. I said yes. I didn't tell him what to expect. I let him come toward it on his own. He arrived at noon in a car that was newer than Mitchell's truck and more expensive than Harlan's, and he was dressed the way Dale was always dressed, with the precise attention to appearance that was not vanity but communication. He wanted you to know at every moment that he was a person of a certain kind, that his external presentation was not accidental, that he had made choices and was still making them and the choices were good ones. It was a language he'd been speaking since he was 19 and I had never been able to decide if it was armor or identity, and I thought now, watching him walk up the porch steps, that it was probably both and that the line between the two had been hard to find for a long time. He came inside. I poured coffee. He sat in the third chair, not Clem's and not mine. He said, "I want to say something first." I told him to go ahead. He said, "I've been the most resistant out of the three of us to accepting that this was handled wrongly." He said, "I want to be honest about that because I think if I don't say it I'm going to have a conversation with you that is partly real and partly not, and I'm tired of the partly not version." I looked at him. This was not the register I had been expecting. I had been expecting the commercial real estate version, the one that moved smoothly between positions and never quite arrived at a fixed point, the one that knew how to make the negotiation feel like a conversation. This was different. This had the quality of something he'd decided before arriving, and was going to see through regardless of the reception. He said Mitchell called me. He said what Mitchell had said had stayed with him. He said he thought Mitchell was right that the Tuesday meeting was wrong in its approach, that coming with the documents already prepared was a management of the situation rather than a conversation, and that he'd known that while it was happening and had told himself the financial logic overrode the relational problem. He said, "The financial logic doesn't override the relational problem." He said, "I know that. I live by relationship professionally. I know exactly how it feels to be managed rather than consulted and I know the difference between the two." He said, "I knew what we were doing in your kitchen and I did it anyway because I had done the math and I thought the math was enough." I said it wasn't. He said no. He said, "And for that I'm sorry." He said it the way Dale said difficult things, with a kind of lightness that was not casualness but the specific grace of someone who has learned to carry weight without letting it pull him under. He said it and let it sit without adding to it, which was the right choice. I told him I heard it. I told him the same thing I told the other two. That I accepted it and I meant it. Then he said, "I want to see the Springhouse." I took him up. Dale in the Springhouse was a different experience from Harlan in the Springhouse and Mitchell in the Springhouse, because Dale was a different person from either of his brothers, and people bring themselves to rooms and the room reflects back a different thing each time. He walked through the door and immediately looked at the shelves with the appraising quality he brought to every space he entered, the real estate reflex, the automatic assessment of what a room was and what it could be and what stood between the two. But the appraisal shifted as he stood there. It did what appraisals do when the thing being assessed is genuinely unusual. It slowed, deepened, became something more. Like actual looking. He said, "How many wheels right now?" I said 21 with 4 more in process. He said, "And each wheel represents how much production time?" I explained the cycle. The milk sourcing, the culturing and pressing, the aging period for each variety. He listened and did the math in his head the way he did everything, quickly and without apparent effort. He said, "So the back shelf, those have been in here since," I said, "October." 6 months. He said, and those are the ones the Asheville people are most interested in. I said those were the ones Sylvie had spent the most time looking at. He said, because the aging environment does something to them that can't be replicated anywhere else. I said that was Sylvie's assessment, yes, and my own. He stood looking at the back shelf for a long moment. Then he said, can I taste one? I cut a wedge from the wheel I had been working through myself, the oldest of the batch on the back shelf. He held it the way I'd seen Sylvie hold it, with both senses engaged, looking at it before tasting it, noting the color and the texture. He tasted it. He chewed slowly. He was quiet for a moment. He said, that's not what I expected. I asked what he'd expected. He said, I expected it to taste like very good homemade cheese. He said, this doesn't taste like very good homemade cheese. He looked at the wedge in his hand. He said, what does it taste like? I said, tell me what you taste. He thought about it. He said, something sharp but not aggressive. He said, there's something underneath that I don't have a word for. Something that tastes like it's been somewhere for a long time. He said it tentatively, looking for a way to be accurate with a language he hadn't developed for this purpose. I said, that's the aging environment. That's the specific character of this hillside and this water and the organisms in the air of this stone room over 100 years. He looked at the stone walls. He looked at Luther Voss's mark on the east wall, which he found without my pointing to it, the same way the others had. He looked at it for a long time. He said, this is very old. I said, 1922. I said, Luther Voss built it the same year the road that ran past our gate was first graded. He said, and no one in our family ever thought to look inside. I said, not until recently. He turned and looked at me with the direct quality he had when he wasn't performing, when the performance had been set aside in favor of something he'd decided was more important. He said, we almost signed this away. On page 3. I said yes. He said, we were going to transfer it with the land because we thought it was a storage building. I said yes. He said, and you let us think that. I said, I hadn't offered anything else and you hadn't asked. He looked at the crate of notebooks. He said, were you ever going to tell us? I said I was beginning to understand that the quiet was going to have to end. I said someone had said that to me in early March and I had known it was true when I heard it. He said, but not necessarily before we got to the kitchen table. I said no. Probably not. I said I had held it close for good reasons that were also somewhat stubborn reasons, and that the Tuesday meeting had accelerated a process that would have happened on its own, eventually, on a different timeline. He said, what would have happened if we'd come without the folders? Just come down for supper and said, Mom, we're worried about the farm. Can we talk about it? I sat with that. I said I thought we might have had a different conversation. I said I thought the Springhouse might have come into that conversation in a more natural way, from the right direction, from sharing rather than protecting. I said I couldn't know for certain because that conversation hadn't happened. He said, that's on us. I said some of it was on me too. I said I could have invited that conversation and I hadn't, partly out of private need and partly out of a preemptive defensiveness that had calcified over time. I said I wasn't asking him to carry the whole weight of it. He stood in the Springhouse and looked at things for a while. He asked about the partnership structure, the numbers, the production projections. He asked with the focused precision of someone for whom financial information was a primary language, and I gave him the answers in that language because I had them and because speaking to someone in the language that comes naturally to them is a form of respect. He said, Ridgeline's a serious operation. He said he knew of them, had dealt with some of their principals at a regional food investment conference the year before. He said they don't take minority positions in things they're not sure of. I said I knew that. He said they were sure of this. I said Tom Garrett had been very clear about that. Dale looked at the shelves one more time. He said, you built something here that a serious institutional partner drove out to see on a Thursday and signed a deal to support. I said yes. He said, I want to be part of this. He said it quickly, then caught himself. He said, I know that's not how this works. I know you have the structure you have and I have no claim on it. He said, I'm not saying it as a negotiation. I'm saying it because I want you to know that I look at what's in this room and I feel something I did not expect to feel, which is something like pride. He said that word a bit carefully, as if he was checking it against the reality before offering it. He said, not at myself. At you. I said that was kind. He said it's also true. We walked back down the hill in the afternoon. He stayed for supper, which he hadn't done in 2 years, And we cooked together in the way we used to when he was young, and the kitchen was the center of the house rather than just a room where the morning happened. He made himself useful in the way Dale made himself useful when he chose to. Efficiently and without being asked, reading the situation and responding to it rather than waiting for instructions. It was the same quality that made him good at what he did, the ability to walk into a room and understand what it needed and provide it. I had always thought he'd misdirected that quality over the years. He'd pointed it at acquisition, at impression, at the management of how he appeared to the world. He was good at all of those things. He was better when he chose at the simpler thing. He left after 8. He hugged me in the doorway with the specific force of a person who has been carrying something for weeks and has finally set it down, not fully but enough to stand up straight. He said, "I'll come back before the drainage work is done if you'll have me." I said I'd put coffee on. He said, "The tractor arrives when?" I said, "End of the month." He said, "I want to see it." I said, "All right." He walked to his car in the dark. He drove more carefully than usual down the gravel drive, as if he was attending to something. He turned onto the county road and the taillights went red in the dark and then were gone. I stood on the porch for a moment in the April night. The peepers were going in the bottom, full voice, the full spring chorus of them, the sound the farm made when it was waking up and committed to waking. The creek was audible on the northeast rise, the same creek running through the same channel it had run through since Voss cut it in 1922, doing what it had always done regardless of whatever was happening in the kitchen or the legal offices or the parking lots where plans were made and unmade. I thought about Clem on the porch in July, about what he'd said and what he'd trusted, about the particular quality of a trust that doesn't require explanation because it is complete. I went inside. I put the kettle on for no particular reason except that the kettle going on was the sound that said the day was managed, that everything necessary had been done, that the farm was in order and the night was earned. It was my sound, the way the peepers were the farm's sound and the creek was the land's sound. All of them together at the end of a day were the full accounting of a place that had kept itself. I thought about the Springhouse in the dark up the hillside, the 21 wheels on the shelves, the creek running under the floor, the spring peepers just barely audible through the fieldstone, the lantern hooks on the wall, the wooden stool, the 5 composition notebooks in the wooden crate beside the door, the temperature steady at 53 degrees in the cold stone room, the same as it had been in every month of every year since Voss set the last stone in the last course of that hillside wall and scratched his name and the year into the mortar and stepped back to see what he had made. The kettle whistled. I poured the water. Outside the window the April night settled itself around the farm the way April nights do when the season has finally committed, carrying the smell of cold dirt and creek water and the particular sweetness of hay in a barn overnight. The smell that Clem had said was the farm's truest character, the one it showed you if you were up early enough to see it before the day got its complications on top of it. I stood in my kitchen at 71 years old, with the tea going in the mug and the night on the windows and the farm quiet around me, and I thought, I have outlasted a drought and a flood and a husband's slow death and 43 years of this ground and 3 sons with folders from a Knoxville attorney. I have 5 composition notebooks full of careful shorthand and a 50-year lease on a Springhouse built in 1922 and a business that a serious institutional partner drove from Asheville to look at on a Thursday and signed papers to support. I have a new tractor coming at the end of the month. I have a woman named Sylvie who calls on Tuesdays to talk about cultures. I have a woman named Caroline who took the long way home one March morning and ended up somewhere useful. I have 3 sons who came eventually, each in his own way and on his own timeline, and who stood in a stone room on a hillside and looked at what their mother had built in the years when no one was watching, and who said the things that needed saying. Not everything. Not perfectly. But enough. The tea cooled while I stood there. I picked up the mug. I carried it to the window and stood looking at the dark of the lower field, at the woodlet, at the rise of the northeast hillside where the Springhouse sat in the dark doing what it had always done. I thought you built a good thing in here. I thought it in Clem's voice, which is the voice I hear it in when I think it, which is at 71 often enough. Outside the window the farm was dark and still and exactly what it had always been, and it was mine. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying. But it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.